The night they thought would last forever began with a silence so complete, even the wind forgot how to speak. It was the 23rd day of December when the sky above the settlement of Hvalvik turned the color of old iron. Thomas Eriksen stood at the edge of the frozen harbor, watching the last fishing boat struggle through ice that had thickened overnight into something that looked more like stone than water. He was a practical man, 47 years old, with hands scarred from decades of rope work and a face weathered by salt and cold. But that morning, something in the air made even him uneasy. "The ice is wrong," said Helena beside him. She was the settlement's elder, 72 years of quiet wisdom, and when she spoke, people listened. "It's moving too fast." Thomas nodded. He'd noticed it too. The sea ice that normally took weeks to form had solidified in just 3 days. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that water left in buckets had frozen solid in minutes, splitting the wood like paper. And now, looking north toward the mountain pass that connected Hvalvik to the mainland, he could see something that made his stomach tighten with fear. The pass was gone. Not hidden by snow or blocked by a storm. Gone. Where there had always been a clear route through the mountains, there was now only a wall of blue-white ice that rose hundreds of feet into the darkening sky. It looked as if a massive glacier had decided to walk down from the peaks and claim the valley for itself. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked quietly. Helena didn't answer right away. She pulled her wool coat tighter and stared at the wall of ice with eyes that had seen 72 winters, but never one like this. "Until the ice decides we've had enough," she finally said. Behind them, the settlement was waking to the reality of their situation. Hvalvik was home to 347 people, most of them families who had lived on this northern coast for generations. They were fishermen, traders, and craftspeople who had learned to thrive in conditions that would break softer communities. But being cut off completely, with winter just beginning, and supplies meant to last only until the spring trade ships arrived, was something different entirely. The ice had erased all roads, just as the old stories had warned it might. Thomas turned back toward the main street, where wooden houses stood in neat rows, their windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns that seemed to freeze solid in the air before dispersing. He could see people gathering in small groups, pointing at the ice wall, their voices carrying across the still air in fragments of worried conversation. He had to think. They all had to think, and quickly.
By mid-morning, the entire settlement had gathered in the meeting hall, a large wooden building at the center of town that served as church, courthouse, and community center, depending on the day's needs. The hall was packed, people standing shoulder to shoulder, their breath creating clouds that hung in the cold air. The building's iron stove burned hot, but it couldn't keep up with the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Thomas stood at the front with Helena and 4 others who formed the settlement's council. Marcus, the stockkeeper who knew exactly how much food they had, Sarah, the doctor who understood their medical supplies, James, the engineer who maintained their equipment, and Anna, the teacher who had mapped every resource within a day's walk of Hvalvik. "We need the truth," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the worried murmur of the crowd. "Marcus, tell us about food." Marcus was a thin man with careful eyes who treated numbers like sacred texts. He unrolled a long sheet of paper covered in columns of figures and cleared his throat. "We have enough dried fish, grain, and preserved vegetables to feed everyone at normal rations for approximately 4 months," he began. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "That assumes the hunting parties can supplement with fresh game. Without hunting, we have maybe 3 months before we're in serious trouble." "The hunting grounds are beyond the ice wall," James pointed out. He was a broad man with oil-stained hands who knew every mechanical system in the settlement. "Same as everything else we need from the mainland, we're completely isolated." Sarah, the doctor, spoke next. She was in her early 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had seen both miracle births and impossible deaths. "Medical supplies are adequate for normal needs. We have enough basics to treat injuries and common illnesses. But if we have any serious medical emergencies, any complications with the 3 women currently pregnant, or any outbreaks of disease in these close quarters," she left the sentence unfinished. Everyone understood. What followed was what Thomas would later remember as the longest silence of his life. It was broken by a voice from the back of the hall. The old stories talk about this. Everyone turned to look at Peter, a fisherman in his 60s who was known for remembering the legends and tales that most people had forgotten. The long night. My grandmother said her grandmother lived through one, said the ice came down from the mountains like a living thing and sealed off whole valleys for an entire winter. How did they survive? Someone called out. Peter's weathered face was grim. Most didn't, but the ones who did learned to become something different. They stopped trying to fight the ice and learned to live with it instead. Helena stood then, and the room fell quiet with respect. Peter's right.
The old ways were forgotten because we thought we'd grown beyond them. We have modern tools, modern knowledge. We thought that made us safe. She paused, looking around at the faces watching her. But the ice doesn't care about what we think we know. It only cares about what we can actually do. Thomas felt the weight of leadership settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. Then we learn, he said simply. We organize, we adapt, we survive, because that's what we do. The council worked through the night, dividing responsibilities and creating systems. Marcus would oversee strict rationing, ensuring every scrap of food was accounted for and fairly distributed. Sarah would establish a health monitoring system, checking on every person daily to catch any illness before it could spread. James would inventory all fuel sources and mechanical equipment, calculating how to keep essential systems running with what they had. Anna would organize the children's education around useful skills, teaching them everything from ice fishing to equipment repair. And Thomas would coordinate it all, making the hard decisions when they needed to be made. But it was Helena who brought up the thing no one else wanted to mention. We need to talk about what happens if the ice doesn't leave when winter ends. What happens if we're still here, still sealed off, when our food runs out? The room grew cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. We cross that bridge when we come to it, Thomas said firmly. Right now, we focus on making it through each day. That's all we can do. As the meeting broke up and people filed out into the blue darkness of early afternoon, Thomas stood at the window watching the ice wall in the distance. It gleamed a low light, beautiful and terrible, a reminder that nature could change the rules whenever it wanted. Emma, his daughter, came to stand beside him. She was 19, strong and quick-minded, studying to be an engineer like James. Dad, are we really going to be okay? Thomas wanted to lie, to give her the comfort she was looking for, but she'd always been honest with her, and he wasn't going to stop now. I don't know, Em, but I know we're going to try everything we can, and we're going to do it together. She nodded and squeezed his hand once before heading out into the cold. Alone in the hall, Thomas let himself feel the full weight of their situation. 347 people, counting on him to help keep them alive. An unknown amount of time trapped by ice that had appeared with impossible speed. And winter, the real winter, hadn't even truly begun yet. The first week was about inventory and organization. Every household reported what supplies they had. Every skill was cataloged. Every potential resource within the accessible area was mapped and evaluated. Marcus set up a central storehouse and implemented a rationing system that was strict but fair.
Everyone received the same amount, regardless of age or size, though pregnant women and young children got slight supplements. The community adapted with surprising speed. People who had been neighbors became something closer, something necessary. They shared tools, knowledge, and the work of survival. James organized teams to insulate every building better, stuffing walls with dried moss and sealing every gap where cold air could creep in. Sarah trained volunteers in basic medical care so she wouldn't be overwhelmed if illness struck. But it was the hunters who faced the biggest challenge. Without access to the mainland hunting grounds, they had to learn to catch game in the narrow strip of accessible coast and the frozen inlet that was all the ice had left them. David led the hunting parties. He was 32, lean and patient, the kind of man who could sit motionless for hours waiting for a seal to surface at a breathing hole. Under his direction, the hunters relearned old techniques that most had only heard about in stories. They crafted better traps from salvage materials. They learned to read the ice for signs of seal dens beneath the surface. They taught themselves to fish through holes cut in the thickening harbor ice, sitting for hours in the brutal cold, waiting for a bite that might mean the difference between eating and going hungry. On the 10th day, David's team brought back 3 seals. It wasn't much for 347 people, but it was something. The meat was distributed carefully, the blubber saved for lamp oil, the skins stretched for repairs and insulation. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. Thomas made a point to thank each hunter personally. "You're keeping us alive," he told David as they stood outside the storehouse, watching the sun make its brief appearance on the horizon. David shook his head. "We're just doing what we can, same as everyone else." He paused, his breath steaming in the air. "But Thomas, you need to know something. The seals are leaving. They're moving south, away from whatever's happening with the ice. In another week or two, there might not be any left to hunt." The news hit Thomas like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "Then we make the most of the time we have. Catch what you can while you can." What he didn't say was what they both knew. If the seals left and the hunting ended, their timeline for survival would shrink dramatically. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, listening to the house creak and settle in the cold, and did calculations in his head. If hunting ended, they'd be completely dependent on stored supplies. Marcus had said 4 months at normal rations, but they'd already used 10 days, and normal rations assumed some supplementation from hunting. Without it, he got up quietly, careful not to wake Emma sleeping in the next room, and went to his small office.
By lamplight, he worked through the numbers again, hoping to find some margin he'd missed, some calculation that would give them more time. But mathematics was brutally honest. Without hunting, they had maybe 90 days before they faced starvation. 90 days to either figure out how to get through the ice wall or hope it melted on its own. And winter had barely started. The next morning brought a new problem. Thomas was awakened by urgent knocking on his door. It was James, his face red from cold and exertion. "You need to come to the powerhouse, now." Hvalvik's power came from a small hydroelectric system, a turbine powered by a stream that ran down from the mountains through a carefully constructed channel. It provided enough electricity for basic lighting and essential equipment. But when Thomas reached the powerhouse, he understood immediately why James had been worried. The channel was freezing solid. "I've never seen anything like it," James said, his breath coming in sharp puffs as they examined the situation. "The water's still flowing from up the mountain, but it's freezing as it moves. Look." He pointed to where ice had formed in layers along the channel walls, narrowing the flow. "At this rate, we'll lose power in 3 or 4 days. Once it's frozen solid, the turbine stops." "Can we heat it? Keep the ice from forming?" Thomas asked, knowing even as he said it that it was probably impossible. "With what fuel? We need every bit of coal and wood we have to keep people from freezing in their homes. We can't spare it to keep a channel open." James ran a hand through his graying hair. "We need to prepare for life without electricity." The council met that afternoon in the growing darkness. With the sun making only brief appearances above the horizon now, the days were mostly twilight, a perpetual dusk that wore on everyone's spirits. They gathered around a table covered in maps and lists, trying to solve an impossible puzzle with insufficient pieces. "We can prioritize," Sarah suggested. "Keep power to the medical clinic and the storehouse for refrigeration. Everything else uses lamps and stoves." "Refrigeration won't matter when it's this cold," Marcus pointed out. "The whole settlement is basically a freezer now, but the medical equipment, the lights in the clinic, those could be critical." Anna spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "The school has that old emergency generator. It hasn't been used in years, but if James could get it working, we could at least have backup power for essential needs." James nodded slowly. "It's possible, but generators need fuel. We'd be trading one resource for another." The debate continued, circular and frustrating, until Helena raised her hand for silence. "We're approaching this wrong," she said quietly. "We're trying to maintain the life we had, but that life depended on resources we no longer have access to. We need to accept that we're living a different life now."
Her words hung in the air like a challenge. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked. "I'm suggesting we stop trying to hold on to what was and fully embrace what is. People survived in the far north for thousands of years before electricity and modern supplies. They had knowledge we've forgotten. Some of that knowledge still exists, in old books, in memories, in the experience of people like Peter who remember the old stories." Helena looked around at each of them. "We need to become students again. We need to learn how to truly live in the ice." It was a fundamental shift in thinking, and Thomas felt something click into place in his mind. She was right. They'd been acting like this was a temporary inconvenience, something to endure until life went back to normal. But what if normal wasn't coming back? What if this was their new reality? "All right," he said decisively. "Helena, I want you to organize a knowledge gathering.
Anyone who knows old techniques, old skills, anything our grandparents or great-grandparents did that we've forgotten. Anna, work with her to document everything and start teaching it. James, get that generator working as backup, but also start showing people how to live without power. Marcus, adjust the rations again. We need to stretch what we have even further. Sarah, prepare the clinic for operating by lamplight if necessary. The council dispersed with new purpose, but Thomas lingered, staring at the map of their settlement and the ice that surrounded it. They were making plans, adapting, trying to survive. But in the back of his mind, a question kept repeating. How long could they keep this up? The power lasted 2 more days before the channel froze completely solid. When the lights went out, there was a moment of collective shock throughout the settlement. Then people lit their lamps, stoked their fires, and continued with the work of survival. The generator was saved for emergencies only, running just enough to keep critical medical equipment functional. In the darkness, life became simpler and somehow more intense. Without electric light, people went to bed earlier and rose later, conserving fuel and energy. Work was done during the brief hours of dim daylight. Families gathered close around their stoves in the evenings, telling stories and sharing skills. Helena's knowledge gathering proved invaluable. Peter shared techniques his grandmother had taught him for making waterproof clothing from seal intestines. An elderly woman named Martha demonstrated how to render fat into long-burning lamp oil with minimal waste. Young Michael, barely 16, showed everyone how his great-grandfather had built remarkably warm shelters using snow and ice as insulation, rather than fighting against them. The settlement was transforming, becoming something that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had visited just a month before. People wore heavier clothes made from salvaged and repurposed materials.
They moved with the careful energy conservation of those who understood that every calorie counted. They spoke less and communicated more, developing an efficiency born of necessity. But the ice kept growing. It wasn't just the mountain pass anymore. The entire settlement was being slowly enclosed by ice that seemed to advance a little each day. The harbor froze so solid that people walked across it as easily as crossing a street. The walls of ice to the north grew taller, blocking more and more of what little sun they might have seen, and the temperature continued to drop, reaching levels that made every breath burn and every exposed inch of skin ache within seconds. Thomas walked the perimeter of accessible territory every morning, documenting the ice's advancement. It was slow but relentless, like a noose tightening around them. At this rate, by the time spring came, they'd be completely walled in, living in an ice canyon with only the sky above them. If they lasted until spring. On the 35th day, disaster struck. Thomas was in the storehouse with Marcus, doing their weekly inventory, when they heard shouting from outside. They rushed out to find people running toward the western edge of the settlement. Thomas's heart sank as he realized what building they were heading toward. The Hansen house. Smoke poured from the roof, black and thick against the gray sky. Fire was every northern settlement's worst nightmare. In the dry cold, with wooden buildings packed close together, a single fire could consume everything. Thomas ran, joining the bucket brigade that was already forming. People passed buckets of snow and ice hand to hand, throwing them onto the flames, but it wasn't enough. "Everyone out!" Thomas shouted. "Is everyone out of the house?" "The children!" a woman screamed, and Thomas saw that it was Ingrid Hansen, her face black with soot, trying to push back toward the burning building. "My babies are still inside!" Without thinking, Thomas grabbed a wet blanket someone thrust at him and ran into the burning house. The heat hit him like a wall, and smoke filled his lungs immediately. He dropped low, remembering that air would be better near the floor, and crawled forward, calling out. "Where are you? Call out if you can hear me." A weak cough came from his left. He found the first child, a boy of maybe 6, curled under a table. Thomas wrapped him in part of the blanket and dragged him toward the door. David appeared beside him, taking the child and carrying him out. Thomas went back in. The smoke was worse now, so thick he couldn't see his own hands. The heat was intense, burning his exposed skin. He moved by feel, calling out, listening desperately for any response. There, another cough, this one coming from what he thought was a bedroom. He found the door by touch, forced it open, and found the second child, a girl slightly older, collapsed on the floor.
He wrapped her completely in the remaining blanket and carried her out just as part of the roof collapsed behind him.
Outside, Sarah was already working on the children. Both were breathing, coughing up black smoke, but alive. Ingrid collapsed beside them, sobbing with relief. Thomas stood bent over, gasping clean air into his burning lungs, and watched the house burn. Despite everyone's efforts, they couldn't save it. The Hansen house burned to the ground, taking with it months of stored food, family possessions accumulated over generations, and precious fuel for heating. But more importantly, it destroyed something less tangible, the sense that they had any margin for error. The fire had shown them how close to the edge they really were. That night, the council met in grim silence. The Hansen family, all 7 of them, needed to be housed and fed. Their personal food stores were gone. Their winter clothing, their tools, everything had burned. "We take them in," Helena said simply. "The community provides. That's what we do." No one disagreed, but Thomas could see the calculations running behind everyone's eyes. 7 more people drawing from communal stores meant less time before they ran out. It meant more strain on already stretched resources. It meant the margin between survival and disaster had just gotten even thinner. But they were a community. If they lost that, they lost everything that made survival worth fighting for. Families volunteered space in their homes. Marcus adjusted the rations again, this time cutting everyone back slightly to accommodate the Hansens. Sarah checked the children daily for any respiratory damage from smoke inhalation. The community wrapped around the traumatized family with quiet care, demonstrating the resilience that came from generations of living in harsh conditions. The fire changed something in the settlement. People became more careful, more aware of how fragile their situation was. But it also brought them closer together, solidifying bonds that had been forming since the ice came. They were no longer just neighbors enduring a crisis together. They were becoming something more fundamental, a tribe, bound by shared struggle and mutual dependence. Thomas found himself thinking about Helena's words from weeks before. They were learning to live in the ice, to become something different. The old Hvalvik, the one that had existed before the ice wall came, would never return. Whatever emerged when winter finally ended, if it ended, would be shaped by these days of darkness and cold and collective survival. On the 40th day, the children began to show signs of the strain. Anna reported that several of the youngest were becoming listless, showing less interest in lessons and play. Sarah examined them and delivered worrying news, early signs of malnutrition. The reduced rations were hitting the children hardest. "We need to increase their portions," Sarah insisted at the emergency council meeting.
Growing bodies can't sustain on what they're getting. If we don't do something, we'll start seeing serious developmental problems. "If we increase children's rations, adults have to take less," Marcus said flatly. "There's no other way. The math doesn't lie." Thomas looked around at the faces of the council. They were all thinner now, all showing the effects of reduced food and constant stress. But they also all wore the same expression: determination. "Then that's what we do," he said. "Adults cut back, children get more. We're building the future, and that means keeping the young healthy." The decision was announced that evening. Some adults grumbled privately, but publicly, everyone accepted it. Parents looked at their children with fierce protectiveness, and the portions were adjusted. Thomas's own meals became barely enough to sustain him, but when he saw Emma's friend, little Sophie, smile for the first time in days, he knew it was right. But in his private calculations, the ones he did alone at night by lamplight, Thomas watched their survival window shrink further. At current consumption, accounting for the increased children's rations and the loss of the Hansen supplies, they had perhaps 60 days of food left. 60 days before they faced choices that no leader should ever have to make. The hunters, meanwhile, had made a grim discovery. David returned from a 3-day expedition with news that confirmed their fears. "The seals are gone," he reported, his face drawn with exhaustion and cold. "We went as far north as the ice would let us. Nothing. No breathing holes, no tracks, no signs at all. They've all moved on." "Fish?" James asked. "We're still catching some through the ice, but less each day. I think even the fish are leaving, going to deeper, warmer water. And we can only cut so many holes before the work burns more calories than the fish provide." The hunting parties didn't stop trying, but everyone knew that from this point forward, they were dependent solely on stored supplies. The land was no longer providing, and the ice showed no signs of releasing them. As December gave way to January, the darkness deepened. The sun barely cleared the horizon now, giving them perhaps 2 hours of dim twilight each day. The rest of the time was night, lit only by lamps and stars, and the strange green glow of aurora that painted the sky with dancing light. In that darkness, time began to feel different.
Days blurred together, measured only by meals and sleep, and the slow routine of survival. People began to change in subtle ways. Speech became slower, more deliberate, as if words were another resource to be conserved. Movement became more economical, every gesture stripped to its essential purpose. Even thoughts seemed to slow, focusing on the immediate and necessary, rather than the distant and abstract. It was as if the ice was teaching them to become like itself, still, patient, enduring. But it wasn't all grim.
In the enforced closeness and shared struggle, something beautiful was emerging too. Old grudges were forgotten, social divisions that had once seemed important faded away. A man who had been one of the wealthiest traders shared his last hidden bottle of whiskey with a fisherman he'd barely spoken to before, and they sat together in comfortable silence, passing the bottle back and forth, while the aurora danced overhead. Children played games that required no equipment, teaching each other songs and stories their grandparents had taught them. Young couples who might have taken years to truly know each other were compressed by circumstance into deep familiarity. Emma and Michael, the young man who had shared his grandfather's shelter-building techniques, spent long hours together, and Thomas noticed the way they looked at each other with a mixture of young love and the gravity of shared crisis. Helena organized evening gatherings in the meeting hall, where people came together to share stories, skills, and music. Peter brought out his grandfather's fiddle and played old tunes that everyone knew, and voices joined in rough harmony. These gatherings became sacred, a reminder that they were human, that they were more than just bodies trying to stay warm and fed. Thomas stood at the back of the hall during one such gathering, watching his people sing and tell stories in the lamplight, and felt a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. They were so brave, so resilient, so fundamentally good. But he knew what they didn't, that in approximately 50 days, their food would run out. And then what? What happened to this beautiful solidarity when starvation set in? What happened to community when survival meant choosing who would eat and who wouldn't? The thought kept him awake most nights now, turning over impossible scenarios in his mind. Could they send out an expedition through the ice? But even if such a thing were possible, it would require resources they couldn't spare, and the ice wall was hundreds of feet thick. Could they somehow signal for help? But to whom and how in this perpetual darkness? Could they reduce rations further? But they'd already cut to near starvation levels, and people were noticeably weaker. On the 52nd day, salvation arrived from an unexpected source. Thomas was making his morning walk around the perimeter when he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. At the far edge of the harbor ice, where the frozen sea met the towering ice wall, there was a change. Not a melting, but something else. A structure in the ice that hadn't been there the day before. It looked almost like a cave opening, a dark hollow in the endless white. He called for David and James, and the three of them approached carefully, testing the ice with each step. As they got closer, Thomas realized it wasn't just a hollow. It was a tunnel, or the beginning of one, cutting into the ice wall at a gentle downward slope.
And from within came a sound. Water running. "It's a melt channel," James said, his voice filled with wonder. "Somehow warm water from below is creating a tunnel through the ice. Look!" He pointed to where water was indeed flowing at the bottom of the tunnel, creating a stream that ran back toward the sea. "Could we follow it?" David asked. "Could this be our way through?" Thomas's mind was racing. A natural tunnel through the ice would be incredibly dangerous. It could collapse at any time. They had no idea where it led or if it went all the way through. But it was the first possibility, the first hope they'd had since the ice came. "We need to explore it," he said, carefully. "A small team, well-equipped, with clear markers to find their way back. This could be our chance." Over the next 3 days, they organized an expedition. David would lead, taking with him James and 2 experienced hunters, Peter and Robert. They packed light but careful, rope, markers, lamps, emergency supplies. The entire settlement came to see them off, standing in the dim morning twilight at the entrance to the ice tunnel. "Remember," Thomas told David, gripping his shoulder, "you turn back at any sign of danger. We need you alive more than we need a way through. If this doesn't work, we'll find another way." David nodded, his expression serious but determined. "We'll find out what's possible. That's all we can do." The 4 men entered the tunnel, their lamplight disappearing into the ice, and Thomas was left standing with the rest of the community, waiting. The first day passed with no word. That was expected. The ice wall was massive. Even if the tunnel went straight through, it would take time to traverse. But by the second day, people were beginning to worry.
By the third day, worry had turned to fear. Thomas stood at the tunnel entrance for hours, staring into the darkness, willing the lights to reappear. On the fourth day, they came back. Thomas knew immediately that something was wrong. Only 3 lamps emerged from the tunnel instead of 4. As the figures got closer, he saw that David was being supported between James and Robert. Peter brought up the rear, his face grim. All of them were exhausted, their clothes torn and frozen, their faces marked with cuts and bruises. "Get Sarah," Thomas called, helping to support David as they brought him out of the tunnel. "What happened?" "The tunnel goes through," David said, his voice rough, "all the way through to the other side. We made it. We saw the other valley, saw open ground." But he coughed, and Thomas saw blood on his lips. Coming back, there was a collapse. Part of the tunnel came down. We barely made it out. Peter's arm is broken. I think I cracked some ribs. Sarah arrived and immediately began examining the injured men. Peter's arm was indeed broken, snapped cleanly about halfway between elbow and wrist. David had several cracked ribs and was coughing blood, suggesting possible internal injuries.
Both Robert and James were badly bruised but otherwise functional. As Sarah worked, Thomas pulled James aside. "Tell me everything. Can we use the tunnel?" James shook his head slowly. "Not to evacuate everyone, if that's what you're thinking. It's too unstable. The collapse happens suddenly, without warning. And even if it were stable, the tunnel's too difficult. Steep slopes, narrow passages, water pooling in low points. Maybe a few strong people could make it through, but children, elderly, the injured, it would be impossible." Thomas felt hope dying in his chest. "But it goes through, you're sure?" "Absolutely. We made it to the other side. The tunnel opens into a valley that's completely clear. We could see trees, exposed ground, everything. It's like the ice hasn't touched that side at all." "But Thomas," James paused, his expression troubled. "The tunnel was already smaller on our way back than when we went in. I think it's closing. Whatever melting process created it, it's not keeping pace with new ice formation. In another week or 2, it might be gone entirely." The news was both tantalizing and crushing. There was a way through, but they couldn't use it. There was hope, but it was out of reach. That night, the council met while Sarah tended to the injured explorers. The mood was heavier than it had been since the ice first came. They'd all been clinging to the hope that the tunnel might be their salvation. Now that hope was gone. "We need to talk about what we've been avoiding," Helena said quietly. "We're running out of time. In approximately 45 days, we'll run out of food completely. We need to start discussing hard choices." "Like what?" Anna asked, though her face showed she already knew. "Like whether we send out runners to try to get help, knowing they probably won't survive the journey. Like whether we start deciding who gets food and who doesn't. Like whether we consider—" Helena paused, looking around at all of them. "Like whether we prepare for the reality that not all of us might make it through this." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas wanted to argue, to insist that they'd find another way, that something would change. But he was tired of false hope. He was tired of lying to himself and to his people. The time had come to face the truth. "We need options," he said finally. "Real options, not wishes. James, is there any way to stabilize that tunnel? Any engineering solution?" James shook his head. "Not with what we have. We'd need heavy equipment, structural supports, expertise we don't possess. I'm sorry, Thomas. If I could see a way, I'd tell you." "Could a small group make it through to get help?" Sarah asked. "The strongest, fastest people?" "Maybe," David said from where he lay on a nearby cot, his voice strained. "But it would be a suicide mission. The tunnel could collapse at any time."
And even if they made it through, they'd still have to cross unknown territory in winter conditions to reach the nearest settlement. The odds of anyone surviving that— He didn't finish the sentence. Marcus spoke up, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who'd spent weeks dealing with impossible math. "There is one other option. A terrible option, but an option nonetheless. If we sent out a group through the tunnel, they'd need supplies for the journey. That would reduce our stores, but it would also reduce the number of mouths to feed. If enough people went, if they took calculated risks to potentially save the rest—" "You're talking about sacrificing people," Anna said, her voice sharp. "Sending them out to die so others can live longer." "I'm talking about volunteers," Marcus said. "People who choose to take the risk to give their families, their children, a better chance. I'm not suggesting we force anyone, but we should at least present it as an option."
The debate went on for hours, circular and painful. Every suggestion led to impossible ethical questions. Every solution required unacceptable sacrifices. By the time they finally dispersed near midnight, nothing had been decided, except that they would present their situation honestly to the community the next day and ask for input. Thomas walked home through streets lit only by starlight and the green shimmer of aurora. The ice walls rose on all sides now, making the settlement feel like a pit, a trap slowly closing. He thought about the people sleeping in the houses he passed. Good people, brave people, people who had trusted him to lead them. And he was leading them towards starvation. Emma was waiting up when he got home, sitting by the dying fire with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Dad," she said as he entered, "people are talking. They know things are bad. They're scared." Thomas sat down heavily beside her. "They should be scared. We all should be. Is there really no way out?" He wanted to say yes, to give her hope, but she deserved the truth. "Not that I can see. Not yet." Emma was quiet for a moment, staring into the embers. Then she said something that made Thomas's heart clench. "If someone has to go through that tunnel, I'll volunteer. I'm young, I'm strong, and you need to stay here to lead. I could take a message to the nearest settlement, bring back help." "Absolutely not," Thomas said immediately. "Emma, no, I won't risk you like that." "It's not your choice," she said softly. "Ad, I've been thinking about this a lot. We've all been thinking about it. You and the council think we don't know how bad things are, but we do. We can count. We know what happens when the food runs out. And if I can do something, anything to help prevent that." Thomas pulled his daughter close, holding her tight as he hadn't since she was a small child. "We're going to find another way. I promise you, Em. We're going to find another way."
But alone in his bed that night, staring at the darkness above him, Thomas couldn't imagine what that other way might be. The next morning, the entire settlement gathered once again in the meeting hall. This time, there was no pretense, no attempt to soften reality. Thomas stood before them and told them everything. Exactly how much food remained, exactly how long it would last, exactly what their options were. The silence that followed his words was heavy with understanding. Then Helena stood. "I want to tell you something about the long night my grandmother survived, the one that Peter mentioned when this all began. The people in that valley, they made a choice. They decided that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about staying human. They refused to become monsters that ate their own civilization to survive one more day. And some of them did die. But the ones who lived came through with their souls intact, with their community intact." She paused, looking around at every face. "We face the same choice now. We can fracture, turn on each other, try to save ourselves at the cost of our neighbors, or we can stay together, share what we have equally until the very end, and face whatever comes with our humanity intact. I know which choice I'm making." "But if we all die with our humanity intact, what's the point?" someone called from the back. It was Harold, a merchant who'd always been practical to the point of coldness. "Dead saints are still dead. And people who survive by becoming animals are no longer worth saving," Helena replied sharply. The debate began again, but this time Thomas heard something different in it. Yes, there was fear and desperation, but there was also something else, a fierce determination not to let the ice win in the ways that truly mattered. People spoke up about fairness, about protecting the vulnerable, about maintaining the bonds that made them a community. Even those who suggested difficult choices did so with obvious pain, not callousness. It was Michael, the young man who'd been spending time with Emma, who finally offered something concrete. "What if we put everything we've learned about ice survival to work in a different way? Not trying to get through the ice or around it, but learning to get more from what's here. We've been treating the ice like an enemy. What if we treated it like an environment we could use?" James sat forward. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know how I showed everyone my great-grandfather's technique for building warm shelters using snow blocks? What if we built outpost shelters on the ice, far from here, places where we could camp while fishing or hunting? It would let us range farther, stay out longer, catch more fish. And ice fishing, if we do it right, could sustain us longer than we thought. There's got to be fish under all this ice, right?" David nodded slowly. "He's right. We've been limiting ourselves to day trips coming back each night."
But if we had shelter out there, we could stay as long as we needed to find food.
We could move with the fish instead of waiting for them to come to us. Sarah frowned. It's risky, living on the ice, far from medical help if something goes wrong. Everything's risky now, Michael replied. At least this way we're taking risks to find food, not just to wait and see if the food lasts. The idea took hold with remarkable speed. Within an hour, teams were forming to build ice shelters on the frozen harbor. James and Michael would teach the construction techniques. David would organize rotating teams of fishermen and hunters to staff the outposts. Marcus would adjust rations to account for the extra energy expenditure required, gambling that increased food intake for the outpost teams would pay off in increased catches. Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Real hope. Based not on miracles or luck, but on human ingenuity and determination. They were adapting. They were learning. They were refusing to give up. Over the next week, the first ice shelters went up. They were simple structures, blocks of ice cut from the harbor and stacked in circular walls, topped with snow and salvaged canvas. But inside, insulated with dried moss and warmed by carefully designed seal oil lamps, they were remarkably warm. Teams moved out, setting up camps at the farthest edges of accessible ice, drilling fishing holes and setting lines. The first team to return after 3 days brought back twice the fish they'd been catching with day trips. The second team came back with even more. It wasn't abundance, not by any stretch, but it was more than they'd had. It was progress. Thomas watched the teams come and go, saw the renewed energy in people's movements, heard the cautious optimism creeping back into conversations. They weren't saved, not yet, but they were fighting back in a way that felt right, that used their collective skills and knowledge, that kept them working together instead of fracturing apart. On the 70th day since the ice came, David pulled Thomas aside after one of the fishing teams returned. I need to show you something. Out on the ice. Something strange. They gathered a small group and headed out, following the markers to the farthest outpost. The walk took over an hour, passing through a landscape that no longer felt alien. The ice had become familiar, its shapes and sounds and textures part of daily life. When they reached the outpost, David led them past it to where the ice stretched away into darkness. There, he said, pointing. At first, Thomas couldn't see what David meant. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw it. A crack in the ice. Not a small crack, but a major fissure that ran as far as the light of their lamps revealed. And more importantly, it was moving. As they watched, they could hear it creaking and groaning, the sound of ice shifting under enormous pressure. The ice is moving, David said. Breaking up, maybe.
Or just shifting. But either way, it's not stable anymore. Not unchanging. Something's happening. James knelt at the edge of the crack, examining it closely. This isn't surface ice cracking from temperature change. This is deep ice, structural ice, moving under its own weight. David's right. Something fundamental is changing in the ice field. They returned to the settlement and called an emergency council meeting. The news sparked intense discussion. Was the ice finally breaking up? Was spring coming early? Or was this a sign of something worse, the ice shifting in ways that could destroy their outposts or even threaten the settlement itself? We need more information, Anna said. We should send teams out in multiple directions, map these cracks, see how extensive they are. And we need to monitor them daily, James added. If the ice is becoming unstable, we need warning before it becomes dangerous. A new routine was established. Scout teams went out each day, mapping the growing network of cracks and fissures in the ice. The outpost teams were warned to watch for signs of instability, and everyone waited to see what the changing ice might mean. Meanwhile, the fishing continued to pay off. Marcus reported that while their stored supplies were still declining, the rate had slowed significantly. Instead of running out in 40 days, they now might last 60 or even 70. It wasn't enough to make it to spring, not if spring was still months away, but it was time they hadn't had before. Time for things to change. Time for new solutions to emerge. On the 80th day, those new solutions arrived in the form of a discovery that would change everything. A fishing team working at an outpost near the northern edge of accessible ice had been following a promising crack, suspecting it might lead to good fishing. The crack had led them around an outcropping of ice they'd never explored before, and there they found something impossible. A ship. Not a modern ship, but something old, wooden, frozen solid in the ice. The team had explored cautiously, finding the deck buried under snow but intact, and beneath the deck they'd found something even more remarkable.
Supplies. Crates of preserved food, barrels that might contain water or oil, equipment they couldn't identify in the darkness, but that clearly represented resources they desperately needed. Thomas stood on the deck of that frozen ship 2 days later, surrounded by council members and work teams, and tried to understand what he was seeing. The ship was ancient, its design suggesting it was at least 200 years old. How long had it been trapped in the ice? Who had sailed it? Where had it been going? But those questions were secondary to the immediate practical reality. This ship was a treasure trove of survival resources. The crates in the hold contained ship's biscuits that were still edible after being frozen for decades or centuries. The barrels held rendered fat for lamps and cooking.
There were coils of rope, preserved canvas, tools, spare parts, everything a ship needed for a long voyage, preserved by the same cold that had trapped them. "This is impossible," Marcus kept saying, even as he inventoried crate after crate of supplies. "This shouldn't exist. Ships don't just get frozen in place with all their supplies intact." "But it does exist," Helena said, a note of wonder in her voice. "And the ice that trapped us has given us a gift. Maybe the ice isn't just our enemy after all." Over the next week, teams worked to extract supplies from the frozen ship. It was hard, dangerous work. The ship was unstable, frozen at an angle, and every heavy step on its deck risked collapse. But carefully, methodically, they brought up crates and barrels and tools, hauling them across the ice to the settlement. Marcus's careful inventory revealed that they'd found approximately 3 months' worth of food for the entire settlement. Combined with what they still had in storage and what they were catching daily, it meant they could survive well into spring, maybe even until summer, when the ice would surely have to release them. The mood in the settlement transformed overnight. The crushing certainty of starvation lifted, replaced by cautious optimism. People smiled more freely, children played with renewed energy. Evening gatherings in the meeting hall became celebrations rather than desperate attempts to maintain morale. But Thomas noticed something else in those celebrations. Yes, people were relieved about the food, but there was something deeper happening too. The discovery of the ship had proven something important, that even in their darkest moment, when all seemed lost, something unexpected could change everything. It taught them that survival sometimes required faith, required continuing to work and hope, even when reasons had all was lost. On the 95th day, the weather changed. For the first time since the ice came, the temperature rose above freezing. It only lasted a few hours, and then the cold returned, but it was enough. People stood outside, faces turned to the sky, feeling warmth on their skin for the first time in months. The psychological impact was enormous. Spring was coming. The world wasn't trapped in eternal winter. There would be an end to this. The ice began to change more rapidly. The cracks multiplied and widened. The outpost teams reported water pooling on the surface during the brief warm periods, creating slush that made travel more difficult, but also suggested melting. The ice wall to the north, that massive barrier that had sealed them in, began to show signs of stress, vertical cracks running up its face like veins. And then, on the 108th day since the long night began, they woke to a sound they hadn't heard in over 3 months. Rain. It was cold rain mixed with sleet and snow, but it was falling from clouds instead of the clear, dark sky they'd grown accustomed to. The temperature had risen to just above freezing and stayed there. People came out of their houses, standing in the rain, letting it soak through their heavy winter clothes, and laughed with pure joy. The rain continued for 3 days. The ice began to melt in earnest. Rivers of meltwater ran through the settlement streets. The harbor ice, solid enough to build shelters on just weeks before, began to break up into floes that ground against each other with sounds like thunder. And the ice wall, that massive barrier that had defined their world for so long, began to crack and crumble. Thomas stood at the northern edge of the settlement, watching huge sections of the wall collapse with a sound that shook the ground. Behind the falling ice, he could see what they hadn't seen in months. The mountain pass, the route to the mainland, slowly being revealed as the ice retreated. But even in the joy of that moment, he felt a pang of something like loss. The ice had been their prison, yes, but surviving it had transformed them. The community that had existed before the ice came was gone, replaced by something stronger, more tightly bound, more aware of what truly mattered. What would happen to that community when the ice was fully gone and normal life resumed? Helena came to stand beside him, as if reading his thoughts.
"We're not the same people who were trapped here in December," she said quietly. "We've learned things about ourselves, about each other. That doesn't go away just because the ice melts." "I hope you're right," Thomas replied. By the 115th day, the ice wall had collapsed completely. The pass was open, still choked with ice and meltwater, but passable for the first time. David led a team through, returning 2 days later with news that contact had been made with the nearest mainland settlement. They'd been assumed lost, given up for dead. Rescue teams and supply convoys would arrive as soon as the pass was fully clear. The final month of the siege was strange. They had enough food now between stores and fishing. The weather continued to warm, though slowly. Life took on a quality of waiting, of transition. People began to think about rebuilding, about the future, about resuming lives that had been suspended. Thomas spent those weeks documenting everything that had happened. Not just the practical details of survival, but the stories. Peter's memories of old techniques, Martha's demonstrations of forgotten skills, Michael and Emma's growing relationship that had bloomed in the darkness. The way the community had come together, had refused to fracture, had maintained its humanity in the face of inhuman conditions. On the 143rd day since the long night began, the first supply convoy arrived. 3 wagons loaded with food, medicine, fuel, and news from the outside world. The convoy leader, a gruff trader named Eric, stood in the meeting hall and marveled at what he saw.
"When you didn't show up for winter trade, we figured you were all dead," he said bluntly. "The ice came down so fast, so thick, we couldn't even attempt rescue. We were going to wait until spring to come collect bodies." He looked around at the healthy, if thin, faces watching him. "How did you survive?" Thomas looked at Helena, at the council, at his daughter Emma standing with Michael, at all the faces of the people who'd endured together. "We learned to live in the ice instead of fighting it. We remembered skills we'd forgotten. We stayed together. And we got lucky a few times." Eric shook his head in wonder. "Lucky is one word for it. Miraculous is another. You should all be dead. By every calculation, you should have starved or frozen months ago." "Maybe," Helena said, standing to address the room. "But we had something that doesn't fit into calculations. We had each other. We had community. We had the refusal to give up or give in. And maybe, just maybe, we had the ice itself helping in its own way. That frozen ship didn't have to be there. Those warm days didn't have to come when they did. Sometimes survival is about more than just resources and planning." The convoy brought enough supplies to carry them comfortably through the remainder of spring. More importantly, it brought connection to the outside world, proof that they weren't alone, that civilization still existed beyond the ice. But Thomas noticed that his people didn't greet the convoy with quite the desperate relief he might have expected. They were glad for the help, yes, but they were also quietly proud. They had survived the long night on their own terms, through their own efforts. The convoy was welcome, but it wasn't salvation. They'd already saved themselves. As spring progressed into summer, the ice continued its retreat. The harbor cleared completely. Ships began arriving with supplies and traders and officials who wanted to document the miracle of Hvalvik for government records. The settlement slowly returned to something resembling normal life. But it wasn't the same normal as before. The changes ran too deep for that. People continued to share resources more freely, maintaining the communal practices that had kept them alive. The evening gatherings in the meeting hall continued, now as choice rather than necessity, because people had learned the value of community beyond just survival. The old skills that had been resurrected during the long night weren't forgotten again, but were taught to everyone, preserved and honored as the precious knowledge they were. Marriages happened that spring and summer, including Emma and Michael's, couples who'd fallen in love in the darkness and were determined to build lives together in the light. Children were born, including several to women who'd been pregnant during the siege. They were celebrated not just as new life, but as symbols of continuity, of the community's triumph over extinction. The frozen ship was eventually documented by scholars who came to study it. It turned out to be a whaling vessel from the early 1800s, lost during an expedition to the northern wires. Its crew had presumably perished when the ice took them, but their carefully preserved supplies had saved lives more than a century later. The ship itself was left where it was, gradually melting free as summer progressed, a memorial to unknown sailors who'd helped save people they'd never meet.
One evening in June, when the sun barely sat at all and the world was caught in that strange northern twilight that lasted all night, Thomas walked to the edge of where the ice wall had stood. There was nothing there now but empty ground, grass beginning to grow in the disturbed earth. He tried to remember what it had been like, that massive barrier of ice rising hundreds of feet into the sky, but memory was already fading. The long night was becoming story, becoming history. Helena came to stand beside him, as she had so many times during those dark months. "You did well," she said simply. "You kept us together when we could have fallen apart. You made hard choices and lived with them. You were a good leader, Thomas." "We all were," he replied. "Every person in this settlement led in their own way. I just coordinated. Don't diminish what you did. But yes, we all contributed. That's what saved us in the end. Not any one person's heroism, but everyone's collective determination to survive together." Helena paused, looking at the empty space where the ice had been. "The long night will become legend eventually. People will tell stories about it, probably exaggerate the details, make it seem more dramatic or more terrible than it was. But they won't really understand what it was like, how it changed us." "No," Thomas agreed. "You can't really explain it to someone who wasn't here. How time felt different, how cold felt different, how we felt different." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, remembering. Then Helena said something that Thomas would think about for the rest of his life. "The ice erased all roads, Thomas. All the paths we thought we knew, all the certainties we relied on. It forced us to find new roads, new ways of being. And maybe that was the gift hidden inside the curse. Maybe we needed to have everything familiar stripped away to discover what we truly were." Thomas thought about that, about the settlement before the ice, comfortable and prosperous, but perhaps too comfortable, perhaps forgetting important lessons in the ease of modern life, and about the settlement now, stronger, more aware, more genuinely connected. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe we did need to lose our way to find ourselves." As summer progressed into fall, Hvalvik healed. Buildings were repaired. Trade resumed. The cycles of normal life reasserted themselves. But underneath the surface normal, the changes remained.
The community that had been forged in darkness and ice and shared struggle didn't dissolve just because conditions improved. If anything, it deepened, becoming not just something that helped them survive, but something that made life worth living. And when winter came again, as it always did in the north, the people of Hvalvik were ready, not just with sufficient supplies and preparation, though they had those, but with the knowledge that they'd survived the worst winter could offer, that they'd faced the long night and emerged with their humanity intact, that they were a community that could endure anything as long as they faced it together. The ice came again that winter, as it did every year, but it didn't wall them in. It was just winter ice, natural and manageable and expected. And when spring came and the ice melted away, it left behind people who understood something fundamental about survival, that it wasn't just about having enough food or fuel or shelter, though those mattered. It was about maintaining connection, community, and hope, even in the darkest times. It was about refusing to let hardship turn you into something less than human. Thomas grew old in Hvalvik, eventually passing leadership to younger people who hadn't lived through the long night, but had been raised on its lessons. Emma and Michael had children who had children, each generation carrying the stories of that winter, when the ice erased all roads and the community discovered new paths. The settlement thrived in the decades that followed, known throughout the region not just as the place that survived the long night, but as a community with an unusual depth of connection and mutual support. People came from other settlements to study how Hvalvik operated, trying to understand what made it different. The secret was simple but hard to quantify. The people there had learned that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant staying human, staying connected, staying committed to each other, even when, especially when, conditions made it difficult. Years later, climate scholars would study the records of that winter, trying to understand the unusual ice formation that had sealed off Hvalvik. They never reached complete consensus on the causes, though theories ranged from unusual atmospheric conditions to specific ocean current configurations to rare geological events. But understanding the mechanism didn't really matter to the people who'd lived through it. What mattered was what they'd learned and who they'd become in the darkness. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled and ice formed on the windows, parents would tell their children about the long night, about how the ice came and erased all roads, about how the community faced starvation and darkness and seemingly impossible odds.
and about how they survived not through miracles or heroism, but through steady determination, mutual support, and the refusal to abandon their principles even when principles seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. "Remember this," they would say to the children, who listened with wide eyes to stories that were history and legend and lesson all at once. "Remember that when times are hardest, that's when it matters most who you are and how you treat each other. The ice taught us that, and we never forgot." The long night became more than just an event in Hvalvik's history. It became the foundational story of the community's identity, the measuring stick against which all subsequent challenges were judged. When problems arose, people would reference the long night, not with nostalgia or pride in suffering, but as a reminder of what they were capable of enduring together. "We survived the long night" became both statement of fact and promise of resilience, a verbal talisman against despair. And somewhere in the ice fields to the north, the frozen ship that had saved them slowly rotted away, its timbers giving back to the earth nutrients they'd held frozen for more than a century. But the story of that ship, and of the long night, and of a community that refused to fracture even when ice erased all roads and darkness seemed eternal, that story survived. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, a testament to the human capacity for endurance, adaptation, and maintaining humanity in inhuman conditions. Because that's what survival truly is, not just continuing to breathe and eat and exist, but maintaining the connections and values and dignity that make survival worthwhile. The people of Hvalvik learned that lesson in the darkness of the long night, and they never forgot it. They became living proof that when all roads are erased, communities can forge new paths, and that the hardest winters can teach the most valuable lessons, if only we're willing to learn. Thank you for listening to this story of survival, community, and resilience. If you enjoyed this tale of endurance in the longest night of winter, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the human spirit's capacity to overcome impossible odds. Hit that subscribe button to hear more adventures from the frozen north and beyond.